and welcome to a panel discussion on the invasion of Ukraine, presented by the Tulane Journal of Policy and Political Economy. I'm Max Weber, editor-in-chief of the journal and co-host of tonight's event.
And I'm Murad Laradji, chief marketing officer of the journal and co-host of tonight's event. This panel, titled A New Russian Empire, aims to examine the current Russian-Ukrainian crisis and the greater historical, political, economic, and cultural context in which it exists.
To do so, we will address the crisis through 5 separate while overlapping academic fields: international relations, national security, history, political economy, and Slavic studies. Combined, these fields provide a complete picture of the invasion, including its past, present, and future implications for global sociopolitics.
Joining us this evening are 6 of the nation's leading experts in these academic fields. Dr. Maria Omelecheva is a professor of strategy at the National War College, a school of the U.S. National Defense University. Dr. Omelecheva's research interests include international and Eurasian security, counterterrorism and human rights, democracy promotion in the post-Soviet territory, and Russia's foreign and security policy, as well as crime-terror nexus.
Dr. Christopher Fettweis is an associate professor of political science at Tulane University. Before Tulane, Fettweis served as an assistant professor of national security affairs at the Naval War College. He has published extensively on the topic of foreign affairs, authoring over 15 journal articles and 9 book chapters, including his most recent title, The Psychology of a Superpower: Security and Dominance in U.S. Foreign Policy.
Dr. Zhiganova is a professor of Germanic and Slavic studies at Tulane University. Her main areas of academic interest include post-colonial and feminist literary theories and indigenous studies, as well as research into protest movements of many post-Soviet peoples.
Dr. Samuel Raymer is a professor of history at Tulane University and specializes in modern Russia. His research and teaching are devoted to problems in Russia's political, social, and cultural history.
Dr. Elizabeth Bodine-Barron is the Associate Director of the Force Modernization and Employment Program in RAND Project Air Force and a Senior Information Scientist at the RAND Corporation, specializing in complex networks and systems. Her research interests include network analysis and modeling for both domestic and national security issues.
Dr. Thomas Oatley is an endowed chair of international relations at Tulane University. He focuses his research and teaching on the intersection of American hegemony and international political economy. Dr. Oatley has previously held a fellowship at the Wilson Center, where he worked on a project titled The Carbon Peace, the Climate Crisis, and the Fragility of International Order.
Today's event will proceed as follows. We will begin with a discussion section during which each speaker will be asked 2 questions by the hosts. We will then transition into an audience Q&A. If you have not submitted a question via our website, you may do so via the webinar's chat.
And of course, before we begin, Murad and I would like to emphasize that while this panel aims to address the crisis from an objective academic standpoint, the Tulane Journal of Policy and Political Economy stands for the Ukrainian people and against the war in Ukraine, including both the humanitarian crisis it has caused and the years of Russian aggression that preceded it.
And now, without further ado, we turn the event over to our speakers.
Our first question is for Dr. Fettweis. Dr. Fettweis, over the last 2 weeks, European foreign policy has been transformed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Germany has called for a dramatic increase in defense spending, marking a divergence from the years of Angela Merkel's minimal defense spending. Europe and the EU are spending more on their own defense overall and have begun sending arms to Ukraine, which marks a complete shift from the EU's previous ban on sending arms to active conflicts. Russia, meanwhile, is using its nuclear capabilities as a deterrent for Western intervention in the invasion of Ukraine, setting its arsenal on high alert and attacking and occupying Russian nuclear facilities. Putin himself stated that whoever tries to hinder us will see consequences that you have never seen before in your history, end quote. In the broader context of geopolitics, do you believe the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Russia's obvious nuclear escalation is leading to a new era of militarization, or in stronger terms, a new Cold War of the 21st century?
Thanks, Max, and thanks for inviting me to your show here. I don't necessarily think we're on the cusp of a new Cold War. It's hard to know what this all is going to mean in a few years. It's hard to know. It's always the case that people think we're at the beginning of a new age, or something that has just happened is going to change international politics forever. And usually it doesn't. Usually after things settle down, international politics tend to look a lot like they did before. But we don't know. We don't know whether this invasion will start off a new round of international rivalries and a whole new renewed era of conflict. Now, right now, the internet, up until this point, the last couple of decades, very sort of quietly, the international system has been very calm, relatively speaking. There's been a lot less violence, internal and external violence in the system for the last couple of decades than in a long time. But rarely do we kind of recognize that. Whether or not this is going to be a new Cold War, I sort of doubt it, because I don't necessarily think this is the first action in a new rivalry, but one of the last actions, hopefully, in the old rivalry. This seems like an extension of the first Cold War. Putin and his cronies are essentially Soviets. They're Soviet thinking. They're just as totalitarian in their, at least their aspirations, as they're the people who led them in the 80s. And it seems to me they've been trying to construct, and we're doing very well in constructing an authoritarian system in Russia for the last couple of decades. And this is I don't know. It may be that in a couple of decades, historians look back on this and say this was one of the last actions in the first Cold War, because Putin, is essentially a Cold Warrior, and the way he governs at home, with his distaste for the media's secrecy, his utter indifference to the suffering of his people, which is the kind of things that we ascribe to the Soviet Union. And unfortunately, the way of war, too. It looked like, sort of, maybe one of the things I can contribute here is a security perspective. It looked like the Russians were going to try something a little bit different, at least tactically speaking. As in the beginning of this war, they tried to get into the Ukrainian cities quickly. It had been their modus operandi in the previous couple of engagements they've had, especially in Chechnya and elsewhere, is just surround cities with artillery and blast them into oblivion. This is what they did in Grozny a couple of times, and it looked like, it looked like they were going to try something a bit new, a bit different, try to be a bit 21st century in their conquest. They failed entirely, so they had seemed to have gone back to reverted to their previous ways of war, and now are preparing for essentially a siege of Kiev. We're going to have a siege that's going to look in a lot of ways like a medieval time siege, where they don't necessarily want civilians to get out of there, because civilians will be eating up the supplies that could and weakening the Ukrainian armed forces in ways that we saw in the Middle Ages. So it's going to get ugly, and it's a bit frightening. And today, I don't know if anyone saw, there's a Russian Defense Ministry spokesman who accused the United States of releasing or training migratory birds to spread what they call bacteriological agents into Russia from Ukraine. You can't really get too worried about what Kremlin spokesmen say, because they're not necessarily worried about sticking to the truth. But what the hell are they signaling with that? What are they trying to say? This thing might get really ugly before it gets any better, because, as I'm sure my panelists are going to discuss, it's hard to see how Putin lets this thing lose. It's hard to see how he can have a defeat and stay in power, and he knows this. So this utterly idiotic, stupid war might look back upon as if you're an optimist, you say, well, maybe this is one of the final shots fired in the first Cold War. Maybe this is a thing that will be a turning point in Russia. You have to be kind of optimistic to hope that, but still, perhaps if I don't want to be as doomy and gloomy as everyone else, as I am usually about this, and think maybe there's room for optimism. Maybe if things go so poorly for Russia, then it won't lead to a long-term renewal of rivalry, but the end of a first one. I think that's my 5 minutes or so. So I've cut myself off.
Yes, absolutely. So, Dr. Omelecheva, Russia is one of the largest military powers on the globe, with their military spending reaching almost $61.7 billion compared to Ukraine's $5.9 billion. Despite its overwhelming military superiority to Ukraine, its invasion has been largely lethargic, with Ukrainian forces holding their own against a larger and better funded Russian force. In fact, The Russian military captured an entire Russian motorized battalion within 12 hours of the invasion starting. And on March 1st, Ukrainian forces neutralized an assassination attempt on the Ukrainian president. Why has Russian military performance been so underwhelming in recent weeks? Why hasn't Russia wielded the full strength of their military might in the opening weeks of this conflict?
Thank you, Murad. And I'm glad they have not wielded all the military might that the Western analysts thought they had. So indeed, the performance has been underwhelming in terms of their failure to accomplish the key operational objectives, such as to take Kiev in 48 hours and to finish off the rest of Ukraine in 15 days or less. I wouldn't call it lethargic, given all the military pounding of Ukrainian cities with artillery and cruise missiles that's been going on over the past week or so. But I will put forth three, what I think primary reasons that can help us understand this poor performance. First is, of course, that the Ukrainian military and volunteers have the home field advantage. They have put up phenomenal resistance that surprised many military analysts in the West. Their morale is superb, very high, and it has been sustained by what I think has been a clever informational campaign by the Ukrainians themselves that has revealed Russia's very clumsy and poorly resourced advances. Another factor is the faulty strategic assumptions that the Kremlin made about Ukraine. We know that the Russian intelligence thought that the Ukrainians were unhappy with their government, that they were pessimistic about the country's future. So the expectation was that the Ukrainian resistance was going to be very light and that the desertion rate of the Ukrainian military would be very high. And as already alluded to, contrary proved to be more accurate, that the Ukrainian morale has been super high. The Russian conscripts' morale has been super low, in part because many of the conscripts were told that they were going to be exercising on the Russian-Ukraine border, but they ended up in Ukraine in order to fight. And last but not least, Russia's military, as we learn today, turned out to be a paper tiger. It is not nearly as strong, well-trained, and sophisticated at the tactical, operational, and doctrinal levels. So there are many reasons, but I think one of the main reasons for this utter failure to modernize its military has to do with systemic corruption in its defense and security sectors. So, for example, pervasive corruption in defense procurement undermine logistics. We all heard the story of Russians, 40 kilometers long motorcade, this line of vehicles carrying artillery and other military equipment just, in a quagmire, getting stuck and attacked by the guerrilla attacks of the Ukrainians, unable to move forward. And there's all kinds of logistical difficulties with the supply of gasoline, equipment, and other types of supplies. And we know that the soldiers also did not receive adequate supply to continue advances. And another example is the lack of fuel that has been linked to embezzlement of funds. And we also know that the soldiers who thought they were training on the Russian-Ukrainian border were simply siphoning gasoline and selling it on the side, and then they ended up in Ukraine unable to make further advances because they ran out of gasoline, so corruption. And many technological innovations, including those that could have increased the precision of Russia's artillery strikes or cruise missile strikes, have never really materialized, also, in my view, due to graft fraud, mostly. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Omele. This next question turns to a more political economic side of the issue, and it goes to Dr. Oatley. So Dr. Oatley, the primary tool wielded by Western countries in first discouraging and then combating the Russian invasion of Ukraine have been economic. And specifically, the West has levied a host of sanctions, increasing in strength as the invasion has continued, aimed at damaging the Russian economy enough to stop or slow down the invasion. While these countries have espoused the strength and speed of their sanction packages, it seems that less well studied is their actual effect on Russia, both on the Russian invasion as well as on the Russian economy and people as a whole. So in your view, what tangible impacts have these sanctions had on the invasion and the Russian economy? And going forward, what sanctions are left for the West to levy? That is, have we exhausted our leverage? And if so, what direction do you see the United States and its European peers taking from here? Dr. Oli, I think you're muted, sorry. Does that work? Looks like we're having. Can you unmute yourself really quick? Looks like you're still muted.
How about now?
That's perfect.
All right, cool. Technical problems. Okay, so I thank you, Max. It's a very important question, but also one that's very difficult to answer. I think part of the difficulty in answering that has to do with the recency of the sanctions. And so there hasn't been enough time elapsed to have a good sense of what their impact will be on structures within Russia. Another complicating factor, I think, is that the sanctions themselves are quite significant. I don't think we've had an instance in the past of so many sanctions being imposed so quickly on such a large country, right? And so it's hard to draw on existing research on sanctions and be confident that what we know from past instances is directly relevant here. Okay, so, but with those qualifications having been said, I would say that in the short run, it's hard to see the sanctions having much, if any, impact on the military operations of Russia. I think that the sanctions are really designed less to weaken Russia's military capabilities in the short run, and more to impose costs on Russian society in the hopes that there will be some reaction in Russian society that exerts pressure on Putin, and through that mechanism gets Putin to scale back operations, if not entirely withdraw. I think where one does see pretty significant impact of the sanctions in the short run is on economic activity. But even then, that seems to have occurred mostly in terms of volatilities. And so the collapse of the stock market, shutting down of the stock market, collapse of the ruble's value against the dollar and other Western currencies. The central bank suspended the convertibility of the ruble earlier this week, I believe, or perhaps that was last week. And so there's been a pretty significant market reaction to the sanctions in ways that have disrupted the kind of financial system within Russia. In addition, I think there's been a bit of a consumer panic. I haven't been in Russia, obviously, but the pictures I've seen are pictures of empty shelves, people lining up in front of McDonald's to exhaust their stock before they close shop. I saw a picture this morning of people lined up in front of Victoria's Secret trying to exhaust their inventory before they leave the country as well. And so there seems to be a lot of panic buying and hoarding. These kinds of purchases seem a little bit incongruous with the nature of the situation, but that's what you see. I think the bigger question is, what's the medium and long-term impact of the sanctions? And here I would say that it really depends upon two things. One is Russia's ability to form economic and political ties to other important powers outside of the West. And here I'm thinking in particular of China, Brazil, India, South Africa, as well as other countries in the global South. And the more effective Russia is at building economic and political ties with countries outside of the West, the more able it will be to do an end run, essentially, around the sanctions and acquire the resources, the technologies that it requires to reconstruct its domestic economy and keep its military force in operation, right? I mean, it doesn't need energy, has that in abundance, doesn't need many of the natural resources from outside, it has that in abundance. So where it seems to be vulnerable is in technology. And so a partnership with China there seems to be important. And I think to flip that around then, we can play a large role, and by we, I mean the West, in impacting the medium and long-term effectiveness of these sanctions. through diplomatic activity oriented toward encouraging countries that are currently disinclined to support Western sanctions to be more on our side, if you will. And that includes the BRICS, right? And other, I think I saw 48 countries in the UN General Assembly did not support the sanctioning of Russia in that vote. And so if we could be more proactive in our diplomacy, that would make a big difference. I think there's one other component here, which is what is left for the West, given the enormity of the sanctions that have already been implemented. And what is left is energy, right? And so the big gap in the current sanctions regime involves Russian exports of natural gas and oil to Western Europe. And that gap is intentional because Western Europe is so dependent on imported natural gas and oil from Russia. And so the next step, and perhaps the only major step left for the West, apart from soliciting support from everyone else, is to try to end those sanctions, end those energy flows as well. And that'll be difficult. I think we're talking nothing happening on that channel until next winter at the earliest. Yeah. So that's kind of my take on where we are with the sanctions regime.
Thank you, Dr. Oatley. The next question is for Dr. Zhuganova. According to Russian official state rhetoric, Ukraine's military, government, and especially their public leaders harbor explicit neo-Nazi beliefs. While there is no evidence to suggest that Putin's claims are correct in their magnitude, Ukraine's military does, in fact, have concrete, albeit small, collections of neo-Nazi fighters. Many leaders of the Azov battalion, for instance, which are one of Ukraine's leading frontline battalions, deny the Holocaust and support the figure of Adolf Hitler, while denying to be actual neo-Nazis. In a recent interview with The Guardian, an anonymous leader of the battalion stated the following: "I have nothing against Russian nationalists or even a great Russia, but Putin's not even a Russian. Putin's a Jew." In your view, how much legitimacy is there to Putin's claims of Ukraine being a harbor for neo-Nazi and anti-Semitic beliefs? How, moreover, can the United States government remain objective in unilaterally supporting the Ukrainian resistance while denouncing the same forms of hatred we combat at home?
Thank you, Murad, for this question. Let me start with this short introduction. So since the beginning of this war, the question on everyone's mind is why Putin is doing this? Why did he start this needless, senseless war? So what's the story, the big story behind this war? Is this yet another war of conquest on Russia's long list of imperial conquests? And without getting, deep into this history, we can talk about maybe even the recent history, the 21st century history, since Putin came to power in the year 2000. This is his fifth war. And all of these wars were fought with the same brutality, bombing the cities, destroying the infrastructure, not just the military infrastructure, but targeting apartment buildings, hospitals, and schools, not being particularly concerned about the loss of human life on both sides. Also on both sides, Russian sides, because we know now that there is a large number of Russian conscripts that are in Ukraine. So this happened, this types of destruction happened in the city of Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, that was almost obliterated in the year 2000 during the Second Chechen War. Chechens were fighting for their independence from Russia since 1991. I know this really well because I'm from the North Caucasus region of Russia, neighboring Chechnya. So, and the same happened in Georgia in 2008, another country in the Caucasus, South Caucasus. And the same happened in Aleppo, Syria, and now it's happening in Ukraine. So then sort of, going back closer to the question, answering the question, a few days before the war, Putin addressed the nation with one of his, this crazy, disturbing speeches. And he gave an hour-long history lesson in which he argued that Ukraine, in fact, is not a real country. It was created by Soviet Russia. He said it's an invented country, an extension of Russia, a country which is now hijacked by the West and run by the neo-Nazis, the government, which is the Ukrainian government, which is hostile to Russia and to the Russian people. And according to Putin, this neo-Nazi Ukrainian government holds Ukrainian people hostage. This neo-Nazi card is one of Putin's favorite cards to play. This is a rhetoric which is being reinforced by the state propaganda machine. Therefore, one of his goals is, as according to him, to Putin, is denazification of Ukraine and the liberation of Ukrainian people. So this is how he justifies this aggression and presents it to the domestic audience. Not an invasion, just but a liberation effort. So basically, Putin has twisted modern history to make a claim that Ukraine is an illegitimate country and Ukrainian people need to be rescued or from the neo-Nazis. So now to answer directly your question, within Ukraine, there is indeed a faction of far-right neo-Nazis who have a political party and a militia force. And this militia force has actually joined the Ukrainian army in the past 8 years to fight Russia back from annexing any more territory in the east of the country. So 8 years ago, Russia took Crimea and the portions of the Lugansk and Donetsk regions. So these far-right groups, they came as a resistance to the Russian occupation, but they also harbor and openly express anti-Semitic as well as anti-Russian views. So in his assessment of this group, Putin is right. These are not good people. These are white supremacist radical groups, and many countries right now honestly face the same problems, right, with them, including the United States and Russia. But he is wrong in his claim that these people are running the country. It's far from it. The data from 2019 elections in Ukraine show that the ultra-nationalist far-right coalition gained slightly over 2% of the vote and 0 seats in the parliament. So his argument is based on this fringe group of militiamen on the far right, and the Russian state-run propaganda machine magnifies it, blowing it out of proportion. Now, with the Ukrainian president being Jewish himself and having family members who died in the Holocaust, I don't see this group getting any support from Ukrainian people. Ukraine is not the same anymore. In the course of these 2 weeks, it has changed dramatically. It became unified. It became united like never before in its history. So Ukrainians, Russians, Jews, and members of other ethnicities came together to defend their country, their way of life, their rights, their civic identity, and their future. So it's also very different from 2014, when in 2014, there was a fair amount of collaboration with Russians living in Crimea, in Donbass region. Now there is no such plurality anymore. The reaction to the Russian aggression in Ukraine is unified. So Russians who live in Ukraine also die under the Russian bombs. So the with the civic identity being strengthened, it has strengthened, and the development of the civil society in Ukraine was on the right track before the war. The government in Ukraine is, for example, much more decentralized than in Russia. The political and social life in Ukraine is much more dynamic and vibrant, and I don't see how these extremist groups can gain any voice going further. And speaking about neo-Nazis, I don't think Putin even needs to look that far. People in Russia, as of right now, have 0 human rights, 0 freedom of speech. Putin sought to destroy Ukrainian identity, but he actually solidified it. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think Maria said, clearly Ukrainian society was underestimated by the Russian propaganda, especially the ability to mobilize, to resist. And I think after this war, Ukraine, Russia, and the entire world will not be the same. So that's, yeah. Thank you. I think I'll stop here. I don't know how am I doing on time.
No, that was perfect. Thank you. And building on something that you said there, so this question goes to Dr. Raymer. So Putin has consistently claimed that Ukraine is an illegitimate puppet state propped up by Western governments seeking to undermine Russian sovereignty. According to Russian state rhetoric, not only are the Russian-speaking Ukrainian people of Donetsk and Lugansk in fact Russian, but the greater Ukrainian nation belongs to Russia. This belief, he argues, justifies both the 2014 incursion into Ukraine, including the backing of Ukrainian separatists, as well as the current invasion. In other words, the current war is not one of aggression or expansion, but a reunification of Russia with its rightful borderland territory. After all, Ukraine translates to the borderland in Russian. Historically, in your view, how much legitimacy is there to Putin's claim that Ukraine is a rightful part of Russia? Looking back to the Soviet and pre-Soviet eras, what is the historic relationship between the two countries, and how did Eastern Ukraine grow to be more pro-Russian than Western Ukraine?
Thank you for confining your question to only one question. You've confronted me with a lot here, and I'm going to try to answer as best I can, but the short answer is there's no legitimacy at all to what he says. If we look back, of course, the Ukrainians and the Russians both harken back to a common origin in Kievan Rus, but there were no Ukrainians and there were no Russians either at the time of Kievan Rus. Modern nationalism didn't exist then, and Kievan Rus itself fell apart, and a big portion of Kievan Rus, the peoples that were, for example, at Kiev, fell under the authority of Poland and Lithuania. So the people we think of as today Ukrainians were for centuries not under the authority of anybody Russian, but rather under the authority of the Poles, the Lithuanians, and later the Austrian Empire. And so the question really, if you get back to it, is are the Ukrainians really part of Russia? For most of the period of the 18th and the 19th century, the real question was, are they under the power of the Poles or of the Russians, or they have their separate identity? And they were not known as Ukrainians for a long time. Actually, the very term Ukrainian shows up maybe at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century. They were known in Russia as Malo-Russians or Little Russians, and in the Austrian Empire, they were known as Ruthenians, and they began to acquire a national consciousness of their own and a literature of their own, and they certainly had a language in the 19th century. And by the beginning of the 20th century, something that'll be on your midterm exam next week, they were already participating in Russian politics as a party. And the Russians were very friendly toward them in a way because the Russians saw them as allies against the Poles. The big threat to the Russians in the 19th century was the Poles, who rebelled against them twice. And in the 20th century, they finally woke up and saw the Ukrainians as a kind of a threat. But after the 1917 revolution, Lenin, in a move that Putin finds to be revolting, set up a union of Soviet socialist republics, and one of those republics, following on, by the way, the creation of a Ukrainian state after the revolution of 1917, there was a brief moment there when you have a Ukrainian state known as the Rada. So you have people known as Ukrainians, and they actually have a state, and then they have this republic within the Soviet Union. And Lenin was very concerned by what he considered the threat of great Russian nationalism. And Stalin, of course, reverses a lot of this, both with the famine in the 1930s and in a general hostility toward Ukrainian leadership. And you get tremendous suffering in Ukraine. Probably per capita, they lost more people than any other republic except perhaps Belarus, partly because of the nature of the fact that much of the Second World War, not to speak of the Holocaust, takes place on Ukrainian and Belarusian territory. But a lot of this is just a nice historical exercise, because the fundamental event that Putin doesn't like to talk about very much and regards as a tragedy is the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And he tends to portray this somehow as something that was imposed or inflicted upon the Soviet Union, whereas in fact, it's something that it imploded. And as we know now, George Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush, and his advisors were in fact doing everything they could to hold the place together for a long time. And of course, Ukraine played a vital role in saying, we're out of here. And every republic, every district within Ukraine in 1991 voted for independence, including those that were least populated by Ukrainian population. That is, even districts that were heavily populated by people of Russian nationality. And by the way, it wasn't only Russians and Ukrainians. There were all kinds of other ethnic groups in Ukraine, and all of them voted for independence. So at that point, we have the creation of a sovereign state. Now, obviously on day one, a sovereign state's very much like an infant that's just been born. And we don't know what the fate of that state is going to be, but it's now 30 years down the road. And the situation we find ourselves in today is one in which that state has gone through an evolution, and that society has gone through an evolution. It's been troubled in certain ways, and 2014 is one of those troubling dates, but it has survived. And according to all the evidence that I have, it has undergone an evolution in which that population has acquired a much more profound Western consciousness. And as one commentator put it, we may be screwed up, but we are free. And that freedom, which I won't characterize as a political structure, but it's a sort of atmosphere that is the only thing I can see is really troubling in terms of Russia's security interest. And I think it was Yavlinsky I was listening to this evening. He said the only part of their program that troubles Putin is they want to be left alone to do what it is that they desire. And that is the major security threat that Russia perceives, or Putin perceives. I don't think there is an entourage. I don't think there is a regime. I think it's just Putin. And we can talk about that later. But the war itself, I mean, others may have some vision of what is going to happen. I have none. I can't envision what the end game here is. But whatever it is, there's going to be left a tremendous amount of carnage right in the middle of what we think of as Europe. Not to speak of what we know now to be at least a couple of million refugees. So there's going to be a lot to clean up. But I think there's no question that if you go back just 10 years, let's make it 2010, I think there was within Ukraine a considerable amount of sympathy for Russia and Russians. And I think that that's been extinguished gradually in 2014. And today, I think it's almost non-existent in Ukraine as a result of the events of the past few weeks. And that would strike me as, I'm not running Russia, but it strikes me as very counterproductive to the Russians. But they made that choice, or at least somebody made that choice for them. That probably is all you need to know for the question you asked me, and we'll go on for other things later.
Thank you, Dr. Raymer. The next question is for Dr. Bodine Barrett. Amidst Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it is also fighting an information war at home. Thousands of Russians have been arrested for protesting the war. The Russian media regulator has instructed social media outlets to remove verbiage that refers to the invasion as an invasion, and has also compelled media outlets to report that the war is going well, despite its clearly slow progress. How has Russia's information war at home affected the Russian people's perception of the Russian-Ukrainian state relationship? That is, how has Russia's efforts to sculpt its own narrative of foreign affairs domestically impacted the Russian nation's view of Ukraine, the post-Soviet bloc, and international affairs more generally?
Thanks. And thanks for having me. I think this is a really interesting question in that what we have often seen is Russia attempting to perfect their approach to the information environment at home and then experimenting with it in other countries, such as Ukraine, and then exporting it writ large to the world to push their various narratives. The narrative that we've seen dominant within the Russian information environment is very much in line with what Putin has been saying to the West. And it's been this enormous clampdown on what little independent media there was has almost been extinguished, right? And so what we're seeing is, looking at least what I would consider more the public information environment, it's almost entirely parroting exactly what the narratives that the Kremlin is pushing. We do see somewhat of an interesting divergence generationally, in that the older generation generally will accept the narratives that are being pushed by the government, while the younger generation often seeks out other sources, using things like encrypted technology sources, or trying to get their news outside of the official state-based media sources. So there is a little bit of tension there. We have seen protests, we have seen arrests. So there certainly is some element of Russian society that is against this war and is expressing that. I fear that that's going to just be completely squashed. I think Putin and his state have a very good track record for keeping all of that in check, and so I only see that as continuing a trend that's already been happening for several years now, in terms of the gradual tightening of the information environment, access to technologies, access to an open internet. In fact, what we're seeing in Russia today is not quite what I would characterize as the Chinese or Iranian internet, but we're getting there, and that to me is disturbing, considering what we had seen a decade prior with Russian access to the internet and a little bit more of a freewheeling sense of ideas and willing to have exchange of ideas and things like that. One of the other interesting things is we've seen the Ukrainians being very adept at crafting their own narrative and pushing back against the Russian narrative, but they are pushing against an uphill battle when it comes to messaging Russians. I think they've done a lot. They've done very, very well in terms of messaging more Western audiences, European and American audiences, and a lot of what they've put together, has contributed to the groundswell of support. When you get a tweet that results in delivery of hundreds of Starlink terminals, that's a tangible effect going from the information environment to the physical environment, right? But we've also seen, at least anecdotally, you have Ukrainian citizens that are suffering talking to relatives that live in Russia, and those relatives saying, "No, I don't believe you." So despite familial connections, they are essentially living in a different information space, right? And not willing to believe what their family members in Ukraine are suffering. So in short, I see that by and large, without significant inroads into expanding access to alternative media sources, whether that's Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, or getting more information to the Russian people, I don't see much chance for the Russian people to really understand what's going on. Now, that may change as things on the ground change and you start seeing more body bags coming back across the border, and the Russian mothers and grandmothers are a powerful force, and so this is a potential target audience for messaging that could be brought to bear.
And thank you for that answer, Dr. Bodine-Barron, and of course, thank you for joining us. I know you're on a different time zone than most of us here in New Orleans, so we do appreciate that. So this next question goes to Dr. Zhiganova. So Dr. Zhiganova, across the world, we have seen a slew of anti-war protests in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. While one could certainly expect these to occur in Ukraine and its allies, we have also seen thousands of Russians in Russia mobilize against the war. Thousands of Russian celebrities, for instance, have signed an anti-war protest form, and thousands of Russian protesters have been arrested by their government. According to one Russian activist interviewed by the BBC, for instance, she stated that everyone is against the war, but not everyone is ready to step up and protest it. Now, this raises an interesting question. So in your view, how do the protests, both outside Russia and within Russia, differ in terms of their message, scope, and the demands of the protesters? Or put differently, how does the phrase "Нет войне," which has become a popular anti-war slogan in both Ukraine and Russia, differ between these two countries?
Thank you, Max, for this question. Well, first I want to say that almost, every Russian has a relative or a friend in Ukraine, and obviously the war is not popular in Russia. So we just, I teach Russian film. We just had I showed you two wonderful anti-war Russian films from the thaw period. Yeah, the cranes are flying, the ballad of a soldier. But the war itself, the word war itself is now banned in Russia, right? So the Russian people have no say in the behavior of their government under the Putin's dictatorship. So how did Russians arrive into the situation when over 140 million people have no say in what essentially a handful of government officials are doing is a very complicated question. So which, we always ask ourselves why democracy and civil society are not taking strong roots in Russia. Okay, so why they have these waves of, in Russian history, waves of democratic changes, and then that slides back to the autocracies, right? So the autocratic regimes. So also when I say Russian people, many in the West and elsewhere who are not familiar with Russia, imagine probably a homogenized, unified entity of people, all, I guess, of Russian ethnicity or Slavs, which is not true. And I know my students don't think in that way, because I always talk about, my position is from the North Caucasus, from the periphery. So my view is sort of different. And I always try to teach my students about all these, the ethnic diversity, different ethnicities that live in Russia, and the oftentimes complicated relationships between these ethnic groups, right? Russians and non-Russians. So the dynamic relationships between these people, many of these ethnic groups were actually incorporated into the Russian, forcefully incorporated into the Russian Empire. So millions of people in Russia call themselves not Russian nationals, but without regarding themselves as ethnically Russian. A Russian national is a matter of citizenship. As for ethnic self-identification, things look much more complicated. There are around 200 ethnicities in Russia, and the Russian Federation is divided into 85 federal subjects, 22 of which are republics. These administrative units that represent the sort of non-Russian ethnicities. Oftentimes when I write about protests, I study protest movements. So what the view that non-Russians have and Russians have might, differ. For example, if in the North Caucasus, there are some protests, again, like for their rights, defending either, it's a linguistic right to to be able to have education in their own languages, non-Russian languages. Oftentimes, these kinds of protests don't find support in Russia, in the centers of Russia. So, so there are a lot of, things going on in terms of the sort of ethnic groups and protests. But going back to your question, so thousands came out to protest in Russia against this war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the latest numbers that I've heard, it was 100,000 people around plus minus in 36 cities. And more than 13,000 protesters have been arrested for holding peaceful anti-war protests. So they were holding signs, "Нет войны," so no war. And then, these are very brave people, because being taken into custody in Russia doesn't mean that your rights will be protected. On the contrary, it's a sort of territory of lawlessness, when police can do anything to you, and there will be no consequences, basically, for the law enforcement agencies. People are afraid. Obviously, many are afraid. To come out and protest, but the silencing of dissent in Russia is going on for quite some time, since Putin came to power. With various methods being used, from jailing and physically eliminating or killing the critics and the opposition leaders, to passing laws that significantly curtailed the rights and freedoms of Russian citizens in the past several years. In the past couple of weeks, the Russian government has basically destroyed the remnants of civil society and a free independent press. And Putin just recently signed a law that imposes jail sentence of up to 15 years in prison for spreading the so-called false information about the military and its activity, Russian military and its activity in Ukraine. Even media organizations can't describe Russian actions in Ukraine as an invasion or a war. Also, the definition of false information is very vague. What exactly is considered to be false information? So the authorities can spin it any way they want. So, and in terms of Russian activists, journalists, writers, many fled the country. Many have already fled the country. Right now, I don't see, any changes without this regime coming to an end, without this regime crumbling and coming to an end. I don't see any way out for Russian society to be to again develop these sort of democratic, develop along the democratic principles, or develop the civil society. But it's wonderful to see that people around the world are unified against this invasion. They come to protest, and that, I think, means a lot to everyone in Ukraine. And yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Zhiganova.
Thank you.
The next question is for Dr. Fetwais. According to many analysts and politicians, Putin has become increasingly isolated and paranoid over the past few years. Witnessing interactions between French President Emmanuel Macron and Vladimir Putin, for instance, a French official stated that the Putin that Macron met at the Kremlin was not the same one he had seen in December 2019, and that what he found at the Kremlin was a Putin who was more rigid and isolated. Other sources find that Putin is becoming increasingly wary of US plans to oust him, especially in light of recent quotes by a certain US senator calling for his assassination. Putin, reflecting this isolation, reportedly likes to quote a sentence from Tsar Alexander III, stating that Russia only has two allies, the Russian army and the Russian navy. In your opinion, how much of Russia's current international aggression is the result of Putin as an individual leader of the Russian state? That is, would this invasion have been possible without him?
No, it's all Putin. And it's not, we shouldn't think of just as an individual, because he's set up a whole regime around himself with a lot of different layers of corruption, which is why it's going to be tough to get rid of him. Nelson Mandela is not walking through that door. If Putin falls, he's going to be replaced by one of these other super corrupt cronies. We shouldn't think there's going to be a total reversal of Russian behavior. And one of the things that's been happening, and that is, it seems to me, and I don't, this is not something that I have any evidence for, but except that this has been a massive Russian intelligence failure. It's been the kind of thing that the Soviets would do a lot during the Cold War, and it's just another sign that this is essentially a Soviet regime. Remember, in the early 80s, the Russian leadership became convinced that the United States was going to be launching a surprise nuclear strike. And they told the KGB and all the intelligence services to go find evidence of this coming nuclear strike. And then when you do that, when the leadership gives clear political advice to the intelligence services, they went out and found that evidence. They went out and found things like blood drives in London and things that they could somehow link together as supporting an impending sneak attack. And I think that's exactly what happened this time. You had Putin and his cronies inside the Kremlin saying, go find evidence that the Ukrainian people are mad at their regime and they would welcome us as liberators. We know this is happening, so just go look for it and make sure that at least that message was communicated well enough to Putin's intelligence services, and they went out and found that evidence, and they convinced these people in the Kremlin that this was going to go smoothly. Because if they didn't believe that, then none of this makes any sense at all. It still doesn't make any sense. It's a colossally stupid invasion. And I don't know, I'm sure all of us on this panel, we've been asked by various media sources, how does this end? And I have no idea how it ends. I don't know how it's going to be, how Putin thinks this is going to go well, why he would want an extended guerrilla campaign on his border, why that would be a good idea, why he thought the Ukrainians would roll over. How could he have thought? He must have known that Ukrainian nationalism is not only strong, but kind of violent. And I don't understand how he thought this was going to go well, but he apparently did. And because it's going to be a catastrophic event for both the Russian and Ukrainian people. And the big country to keep an eye on, and I'll wrap up with this, is the Chinese. How are the Chinese going to react over time? Right now, they've been more or less standing with Vlad. There are Chinese reporters embedded with the Russians out there, but there's signs that they're not totally happy with this. I'm sure it seems to me that Putin lied to Xi just like he lied to the Germans and the French about this impending war. And I don't think they want to be standing with this pariah. And if they do what I think they're going to do, which is surround Kiev and go medieval on it, it's going to be very difficult for the Chinese to stand with them. And China's Putin's last potential banker. Because you take away China, you take away that economic connection. I don't know how his economy can putter on even a little bit without at least tacit Chinese support. So watch what the Chinese do, I think, in coming days, in coming weeks, because this thing isn't going to be over, maybe coming years. Because if they're going to see how the world reacted to Vlad and his adventure, they're not going to be eager to do it again. You hear some right wingers say, "Oh, is this? Why they haven't even let it. But that's an unstable internet, so maybe I'll just reserve time for my colleagues.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Fetweiss. And I think that we caught almost all that you said there, except for the very end. So we appreciate the response. And this next question is actually going to be asked by Jack Zucker. Now, Jack is an intern on the journal staff. Jack is very particularly interested, both in his research and personally, with international conflict and with conflict between nations and within nations. Of course, Jack helps with event management. Jack helps with our entire editorial process. Jack helps with the management of the journal. So we're very thankful that he's here, and we're very, very thankful that he wrote this question. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Jack, to ask that question.
Thanks, Max. So my question is for Dr. Omelecheva, and I have a question regarding the legitimacy of the war crimes argument being pushed by NATO and Western allies. So Russia has been observed through footage and eyewitness accounts using cluster bombs and thermobaric weapons to strike targets in Ukraine. Many have called for the banning of these munitions as they are known to cause unnecessary harm to civilian populations. NATO has accused Russia of war crimes, claiming that their usage of these munitions in civilian areas violates international law. Further, they stated the attack on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant violates a clause in the Geneva Convention that prohibits attacks on nuclear plants. So my question is there any merit to these claims and accusations? And if found guilty, will this alter Russia's war plans?
Yes, sure. So to this list of horrendous crimes, I will add the intentional targeting of civilian infrastructure, including hospitals. And as we speak, they continue shelling Mariupol, the city that has received most of destruction up to date. So briefly, of course, there are many merits to these claims. And as we know, the International Criminal Court, and not only International Criminal Court, but also the courts of Germany and Spain launched investigations into these crimes. Even if there is no direct ban on the use of these weapons in specific conventions. There are Geneva Conventions, and there is jus in bello, the laws in war that prohibit disproportionate, indiscriminate targeting, the kind of targeting that the Russians have been engaged in Ukraine. And so what, I don't want to say what works in Ukrainian favor, but so the modern day technologies kind of facilitate the collection, transfer, and authentication of evidence. And the Ukrainian side has done a good job collecting and preserving all of this evidence for future investigations, something that the investigators had a lot of difficulty with in post-genocide Rwanda or in post-war Yugoslavia. So to me, the greatest challenge would be actually with connecting Putin directly to offenses. Like many of you will think like, what? So it's not enough to just collect evidence of those crimes. It is important to establish the command and control, that the orders came from the president, and simply just, based on the history of these kinds of trials, there have been a handful of those, but it's just been very, very difficult to establish this line of command with certainty. An even greater challenge would be with convicting Vladimir Putin, because ICC does not hold trials in absentia. So to put Putin on trial, who is the sitting head of state, will require a regime change in Russia. And I don't think it's forthcoming. And in a very, very unlikely scenario that there is a new government in Moscow, this new government has to agree to cooperate with the court, but they can also choose to institute their own courts and try perpetrators at home. So there are lots of if and buts. But in any case, I think the announcement of these trials, unfortunately, they're not going to alter the course of the war, but it doesn't mean that these prosecutions should stop. On the contrary, they should continue. And I will note that the International Criminal Court kind of has an advantage because it launched persecution in 2014 in the alleged war crimes in Ukraine. And it took 6 years for a then prosecutor to review the evidence and find a reasonable basis to believe that the war crimes were committed. So the current prosecutor is actually picking up the old case and can broaden it to include crimes that have been committed during this war, thus essentially kind of curtailing what could have been, a decade-long collection, review, and assessment of evidence. So I think, again, there's merit to these claims. It's going to be very difficult to convict the perpetrators, but it shouldn't stop these judicial bodies from seeking to prosecute these war criminals.
Thank you, Dr. Omelecheva. This next question is for Dr. Bodine-Barrett. In an era of increased capacity of cyber technology, the United States has exhibited a hesitancy to push Putin too far, not just regarding his nuclear capacity, but his cyber capacity as well. The top senator overseeing the US intelligence agencies claims that Russian cyber attacks could bring even more NATO countries into a much broader war. How has cyber warfare played a role in the invasion of Ukraine thus far? How has it played a role in Russia's broader military strategy prior to the invasion? And in your opinion, does it pose a threat of escalating tensions outside of the post-Soviet bloc? And how should the US respond to all of this?
Yeah, so this is a question that's been on my mind a lot lately. So in short, yes, I think that there is entirely a possibility of the use of cyber warfare in this conflict to potentially escalate. And so a lot of people are very hesitant and cautious regarding it. I will admit that a lot of my colleagues and myself were surprised to see the lack of cyber operations playing a role in the invasion thus far. I think a lot of us kind of held up Russia as, really well suited to this sort of multi-domain operations where you're bringing to bear cyber operations to cripple infrastructure combined with kinetic operations. And so we honestly expected to see a lot more of it. We've seen some, certainly there was distributed denial of service attacks on government websites and other things. There was, some wiper attacks that destroyed data and things like that. But by and large, we haven't seen a whole lot of real impact on the battlefield from Russia's cyber operations. And honestly, I think that's been a bit surprising to many of us. A lot of different reasons as to why that could be the case. These things are not as easy to do as we sometimes like to think. Problems do happen. It's possible that we underestimated the strength of Ukrainian defenses in this area. It's also possible that Russia has chosen to hold back, just as they've chosen to hold back in some of their other capabilities in this area. So it's entirely, pick your favorite reason. I don't think we'll know, and I don't think we'll know for a while. But I could see it playing a greater role, perhaps. One of the other things is, this idea if the ultimate goal is to invade and take over and use the infrastructure, then you don't want to destroy that infrastructure, right? And so that could also, somewhat tide their hands when it came to using certain cyber capabilities. For the other part of the question, in terms of, how's it played a role in military strategy prior to the invasion? Certainly, dominance of the information environment, as I alluded to previously. Using things like disinformation and pushing strategic narratives, very different messages aimed at the West versus, Eastern European versus their domestic audiences, and tailoring that. But they've shown quite a good ability to be able to do that in the past. And so the lack of impact on the Ukrainian population of those messages and the surprising use of messages by the Ukrainians, I think has caused a lot of us to kind of take a step back and reevaluate, what is the use of these sorts of capabilities in conflict? I think right now we're seeing the very effective use of them, at least in terms of the messaging, non-kinetic capabilities by the Ukrainians, less so by the Russians.
Yeah, thank you so much for that response, Dr. Bodian-Barron. So this next question goes to Dr. Raymer. And so, Dr. Raymer, barring, of course, the Soviet era, the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian state have had a historically close relationship. In the Tsarist era of the 1800s, for instance, the Russian state sought to consolidate the influence of the Orthodox Church by absorbing the Greek Orthodox Church. And in connection, Putin today views himself as a messianic figure who wants to reunite the Russian and Ukrainian churches, which split in 2019. How does Russia's modern relationship with faith, in the context of Russia's historic relationship with religion, play a role in the Russian invasion of Ukraine? I believe you're muted, Dr. Raymer.
To back up, Peter the Great more or less transformed the church into a department of state, but the Orthodox Church was the primary sense of identity that Russians had. So if you had asked a Russian in the 19th century, "Who are you?" he would have said, "I'm Orthodox." That's their sense of identity, and this, of course, went away during the Soviet period, although people would secretly baptize their children and grandchildren, more than you might be aware. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the equal collapse of Marxism as an organizing faith, you saw the resurrection of Orthodoxy. And I was quite stunned. I went back to Russia in 2014. It had nothing to do with Ukraine, but we were there when that happened, and I could see the evidence of this both at a popular level and in public ceremonies. Priests everywhere, I was at a Chekhov festival, and a priest gave the opening lecture. He was quite well informed about Chekhov and gave a perfectly respectable introductory lecture. And then I went to a spring with an editor, a spring to get some fresh water, and people were lined up there. It was what was called a holy spring, and he asked me whether I was going to immerse myself in this spring, and I said, "Well, actually, I'm not planning on that." But people were doing that, and so there was all kinds of religiosity that was popular. I could see, I was witness to, and then when I was teaching about Sergei of Radonezh, a saint of the 700 years ago, my students were likely to get bored, I thought. And I said, you think Sergeyev Radonezh, because it was 700 years ago, is irrelevant. But let me turn on YouTube here and you can see Mr. Putin is addressing all these bishops gathered together on the 700th anniversary of his birth. So you brought together the secular and the religious authorities at the same moment there. I said, Sergeyev Radonezh is a big deal, believe me, even though it was 700 years ago. And of course, Putin, my most memorable moment on YouTube was watching Putin sit down with the patriarch, and the patriarch turns to him and says, you know, I have a great responsibility. I speak for the country. And I have to tell you, Vladimir Vladimirovich, you are the greatest thing since sliced bread, more or less, is what he said. I mean, it wasn't exactly a radically critical thought, but of course it was nice for Putin that he was armed with the authority of the patriarch. And that, I think, is pretty much how it works for him. The split in the church is not something he's liable to be able to remedy, especially after this war. I don't think the Ukrainians are going to be anxious to heal that breach. And in fact, of course, they opted for the breach because they wanted their own patriarch. It is important to mention here that they also, the Orthodox Church, tried to reduce the amount of proselytization by American Baptists and others. And they did declare, yes, we have several historic faiths: Islam, Judaism, Roman Catholicism, and Orthodoxy, but we don't welcome a free market, so to speak, in all kinds of religions that aren't part of our historic legacies. And so they've tamped down on that kind of competition. And Orthodoxy for Russians and I think Ukrainians alike is sort of the official path, but it's put down roots. But you never know. I mean, I've told my classes, come to my church, look around, and tell me what people believe as they sit there in the church. And if you can tell, you're better than I am. And people come for various reasons, and that's the same is true in an Orthodox church. But there is this closer marriage of politics and religion under the traditional Orthodox framework, and Putin tries to take the best advantage of that he can, and he presents himself and his church as being moral exemplars compared with the West, which endorse all of these things that are acceptable practices here, or at least contentious practices here, seen as part of a program of human freedom, whereas they're portrayed as examples of betrayal of the trust that God put in our hands. Abortion, for example. All kinds of other things that are contentious political issues here. That's about all the wisdom I have to offer on this question.
Thank you, Dr. Raymer. The last prepared question we have for today is for Dr. Oatley. Dr. Oatley, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has directly and indirectly led to a dramatic increase in oil and natural gas prices. After all, Russia is the world's third largest oil and gas producer, with many Western European countries wholly or partially dependent on a consistent supply of these resources from Russia. Clearly, there has been hesitancy among many Western states to fully economically mobilize against Russia for fear of jeopardizing this flow of fossil fuels. Germany, for instance, was reluctant to bring the Nord Stream 2 pipeline onto the negotiating table as a means of discouraging the invasion. However, less well studied is the reaction of people to these countries, of these threats of increased gas prices. In your view, how has a Western dependence on Russian oil historically sculpted their relationship with Russia? Furthermore, how does the threat of high gas prices among the Western people shape their government's policy responses to this invasion? Do you foresee prices reaching a certain point at which the Western people, and thus their governments, lose all motivation to combat current and future Russian assaults on the sovereignty of its neighbors?
All right, well, thank you. That's an excellent question. I'm hesitant to answer it, however, because I don't really want to turn our attention from the conflict and its broader meaning to what higher energy prices might mean for those of us in the West. for whom this might be the most serious consequence of this crisis. Instead, I'm going to go off script, and I want to invoke my privilege as last commentator to try to come back to where we started. And where we started was with a question by Max to Professor Fettweis about what this means more generally for the international system. And Professor Fettweis offered one answer, and I want to offer the alternative perspective. And it seems like that gives us a full scope. And so for me, I think what we are seeing is a really fundamentally pivotal moment in the post-World War II and post-Cold War order. I think that there is no going back to where we were in this global order 3 weeks ago. The world has changed irrevocably. And on a number of instances, a number of commentators tonight has mentioned that Russia will not withdraw, bring this conflict to an end, unless Putin is removed and his cronies. And no one, I think, has offered convincing or even tried to make an argument that Putin is about to be removed or stepped down. And so this is the new reality, right? And I think it's this act has begun to fracture the international system and risks fracturing that system even more fundamentally in creating the possibility of, I don't know how you want to characterize the West in this world, but a US, a Western Europe, and Eastern and Central European blocs associated with or supported by ANZUS and so forth, allied against, arrayed against, confronting a bloc of Russia, potentially China, India, Brazil, and a whole host of other lower income societies. And for me, I think that the conflict here is more than, and I say this with all great respect to the Ukrainians and the struggles that they are having and the horrific nature of this war. But I think for Putin, this conflict isn't fundamentally about Ukraine. I think this conflict is really about his attempt to destroy the post-war order as a necessary step of reasserting Russian great power status in the international system. Because there is no possibility for Putin or Russia to be a great power in an Anglo or American-led international system, right? I mean, it was, what, 2014, where President Obama, I think, alleged that President Putin was on the wrong side of history. That is not how you treat a great power. And so the only way that Putin can realize his true ambitions, I think, is if he's able to create a real serious cleavage or fracture in the international order. And so this is where I see the danger of the current moment. And our response, I think, and I'm going to echo Chris's point, needs to be tailored in a way that we attract China away from a coalition with Russia by emphasizing the economic side of the bread rather than the authoritarian side, and get them to realize that they benefit dramatically from participation in the global economy in ways that Russia doesn't, and that Russia hasn't ever benefited. And I think if we can restore and repair relations with China, we're never going to be best friends, but that will be a useful and important step toward countering and more effectively containing Putin's ambitions. So I think we are really at a very fundamentally pivotal moment, and the world has changed, and we need to kind of adapt ourselves to these changes in ways that create the best outcome for us. Thank you. So sorry, Max and Murad.
No, and thank you so much for that response, Dr. Early. I think it was a good way to pivot us into the next section of our event. So we actually thank you for pivoting away from our gas prices question. And with that, the event is now going to turn into a brief audience question and answer section. So please use the Q&A or chat function on this Zoom webinar to submit a question if you haven't already. And if you would like, you may ask the question to a specific speaker, or you can address it to the panel overall, and we will assign the question. So we're going to start off with a question that we've actually received 4 or 5 answers, 4 or 5 questions at this point, both between our website and the Zoom call. And there's one that's particularly well phrased. So clearly this one is to Dr. Fetweiss. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine, many eyes have turned to Taiwan, given China's longstanding threat to take over the island nation by force. How has Russia's actions and the responses to them by the West changed Beijing's calculus about invading Taiwan? And then there's a second question I'd like to throw in there. What is the significance of Russia recognizing Taiwan as a hostile country in regards to its relationship with China?
Well, I'll be brief on this one, and keep in mind the most pessimistic forecast, the people in the Defense Department who were saying that China will soon be ready to invade Taiwan, we're putting it out about 6 years away. They still don't have the military capability to do what Russia's doing now to Ukraine and Taiwan. And like I said, I don't think that, depending on how this goes, I disagree with the sort of this emerging narrative that, oh, now the Chinese will be eager to take over Taiwan and give this a try, because I think they're going to see what's going to happen to Russia and how people are going to be lining up for pickles again, just like in the old Soviet days. And it's not going to be a pleasant experience. And I can't imagine that they will come away from this thinking it would be a good idea to invade Taiwan. That having been said, I couldn't imagine how Russia thought it would be a good idea to invade Ukraine. So what the hell do I know? But if I were a gambling man, I would say that, and I would that the odds of China attacking Taiwan have been unaffected by what's going on, and if anything, made somewhat less likely.
Thank you, Dr. Fetweiss. A brief question I'll answer very quickly before another audience question was, where will this recording be posted? It'll be posted on our website as soon as we can humanly post it after this panel concludes. But the actual question from the audience that I wanted to ask is to the panel as a whole. Ukraine and Russia are historically large grain producers. How will the occupation of Ukraine and its sanctions on Russia, or the West sanctions on Russia, affect the European food supply? And if this continues, what will likely be the long-term consequences?
I will begin, if you don't mind. I think it's not only about Europe, but it's about Middle East as well, because you're correct that Russia and Ukraine combined make up about a third of global wheat supply. And Ukraine is also a major supplier of livestock, corn, oil that is used in food processing. But let me just talk a little bit about wheat. And there are quite some alarming publications that are coming out about the kind of the imminent effects of this war on wheat supplies to Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, other Middle Eastern countries that use wheat in the production, making of bread, which is their the main staple of their diet. And so by current estimates, right now, and another reason is that Ukrainian wheat was priced a little bit lower that wheat produced or sold by other major producers. So it was, more affordable to those governments, especially Egypt in particular subsidizes wheat and flour domestically. So, you draw the parallels with the Arab Spring in 2011 and what the sources of that instability were. And so obviously if war drags on and the current supplies of grain are estimated to last through the middle of the summer, there will be serious effects, as serious as possibly famines in some places on the planet.
Can I add to that? Also, the secondary impact of high natural gas prices. Natural gas is a critical input to ammonia manufacture, which is critical input to fertilizer manufacture. And so as natural gas prices rise, wheat prices go up too. And so I think this is kind of a double shock for not just the Middle East, where there'll be scarcity, but globally, prices are up. And that's going to hit the lowest income households the hardest. And I think Western Europe perhaps, but really the lowest income households are in the global South. And so that's where I would expect to see the greatest impact.
All right, thank you for both of those responses. And now we have another question. So this one is for Dr. Bodine Barron. So currently, Congress and public opinion are strongly in favor of both a no-fly zone and facilitating the transfer of Soviet-era jets from Poland to Ukraine. The Biden administration has pushed back due to the nature of direct conflict that a no-fly zone entails, as well as the complexity and danger to American personnel of enforcing one in such a contested environment. Do you think that there is a red line that would change the mind of the Biden administration and convince them convince them more direct conflict was necessary in Ukraine? And if so, what would that line be?
So that's an interesting question. I think with the situation as it currently stands, no, I don't think there will be a no-fly zone. It would mean conflict between NATO and Russia, and that is not something that anyone in NATO or the United States actually wants. It plays right into Putin's narrative for justification for this war, and it could easily escalate into a much broader conflict. And so I think all of the sanctions and other activities that you're seeing are designed to avoid having to go there. In terms of red lines, I hesitate to address red lines. I think red lines have been controversial in the past, and if you state them and then someone kind of gets close to them or even goes over them a little bit, like do you actually respond? So I think it would have to be something above and beyond what we've seen in Ukraine currently. It would have to be something above and beyond what we've seen in terms of, say, for example, chemical weapons use in Syria. I would say we'd have to something that could potentially spiral and create something like a no-fly zone would be an accidental strike across the border that actually lands in a NATO country. If we can't de-escalate from that quickly, then yeah, I could see us imposing a no-fly zone. But I mean, for the people calling from a no-fly zone, what you're calling for is conflict, active armed conflict with Russia. And so I think a lot of people say, oh, you just impose this and it's not that big of a deal. It really is. This is a very big deal, and it has immense consequences for pulling the United States into an actual armed conflict. So I don't see it happening anytime soon. And I can't really speculate as to what might actually cause it to happen.
May I interject very briefly? I do think that public outcry and pressure on the Congress actually have had impact on the government decision making by kind of enlarging the pie of possible alternative solutions to the open sky. I think right now there is a realization that the United States probably should not have withdrawn almost 300 trainers that were in the western part of Ukraine. I think the United States and NATO partners understand that if they were to allow Putin to wipe out Ukraine, or destroy cities all the way to the west of Ukraine, that is really going to tarnish the image of NATO. It's not conducive to NATO's unity and NATO's future mission. So I think there is a possibility to actually bringing in NATO forces in the western part of Ukraine, creating some kind of a buffer zone, a wall to protect that part, and especially if Zelensky and governments chooses to move and into that location. And what it will do is that it will kind of kick the ball into Russia's court, and Russia will be in the position to choose whether or not it wants to escalate. A lot of these decisions are made based on some critical assumptions. And one of those assumptions that undergirds this possible strategy is that Vladimir Putin will only back down when he's presented with a credible threat. And then he's the one who makes a decision as to whether escalate or not. That will then go into the spiral of escalation, possibly leading to a nuclear escalation. And if he is a rational actor, and many believes that he is a rational actor, he will probably avoid doing that. And we've had a few precedents in the past when presented with the credible threat, he kind of backed down.
Maybe I could just do 15 seconds on that, because I think that would be an extraordinarily bad idea. If we put NATO troops into Ukraine, we risk escalating. And no matter how bad things are, remember in international politics, one of the rules is they can always get worse. And if we do that, it will get worse.
So very much in continuity with that, we've had this question several times so far, but generally, what do you all perceive as the risk of an actual nuclear exchange occurring? So Putin has made this threat several times, but and this isn't a specific question that I'm asking, just sort of generally, what are your feelings about this?
So can I answer for non-nuclear exchange?
Yes, of course.
So I'm not a nuclear expert, so I will not answer that. I could see an actual non-kinetic exchange. I could see massive cyber attacks on US infrastructure, US businesses, Western European infrastructure and businesses. I could see this turning into something that would play out in the cyber realm as a larger conflict before we would see kinetic conflict and certainly before nuclear conflict.
I'd like to ask one question. It seems to me that Professor Odley is right, that this is not just about Ukraine at all, but how much further it goes in, say, a conventional sense, seems to me to be how, I mean, I can't see how they get out of Ukraine. And it may be that they'll be so bogged down with Ukraine for so long that they'll have no appetite for anything. But Lithuania is a very attractive target for them because it separates them from Kaliningrad. And I don't think his appetite's easily satiated. And my question is, I don't understand exactly the military arrangements that NATO has. It would seem to me that we have every reason to make sure that we present a credible, conventional preparation so that he would look at that down the road, not very far, and say, this is not something I want to try. I'm not interested in going into this kind of situation. I'm not enough of a military specialist. Maybe we already have that, but from what my experience is that the number of forces that we have in the Baltic is almost symbolic for the moment. And if they're only symbolic, I don't think he's impressed by symbols anymore. I don't know. I think that it dawned on me one day. I thought, we have to ask ourselves, what does he define as respect? Respect might be, I want every European to go to bed at night in fear. I want them to tremble at night, wondering what I'm going to do. That may be his notion of respect. It's not mine, but it might be something that we ought to think about after seeing what we've seen in the last 3 weeks.
Yeah, I think you're right, Sam. I think that especially domestically, Putin has that same way, that power is the only way you can have a lot of power is when you're feared. But to answer your question quickly about Baltic military capabilities, last I saw, all 3 Baltic countries together have a grand total of 0 combat aircraft, and I believe less than a half a dozen tanks. And so and they're all old Soviet era tanks. They don't have any kind of military option. If Putin wanted to march into Riga, he could. The only way we could stop him was with nuclear weapons. So do we really want to do that? That's sleep time.
But then we are simply kicking into the future, the inevitable, because what we are saying here, and again, we are making very, very important assumptions. If an assumption is that Putin is not going to stop at Ukraine, that he is going to develop more of an appetite and he's going to move into Moldova, move into Belarus, and maybe Poland and whatnot, then are we just postponing an inevitable? So if we are going to be presented with this inevitability of facing the risk of nuclear escalation after he would have obliterated thousands of Ukrainians, why are we not exploring something that we know worked in the past? Today I was privy to a story. We don't know, how valid and accurate it is, but over the course of Russia-Georgia war, when Russia considered taking over Tbilisi and, just doing pretty much what it is doing right now in Ukraine. And then Secretary of Defense Mueller called the counterpart in Russia, Makarov, and he said, look, we are bringing Georgians from Iraq, and we want to make sure that no one is shooting us while we are in the airspace. Nothing happened, and then they're all back. I mean, so this story appears in many different iterations. There was also something about the ship in Black Sea. But again, I cannot speak to the accuracy, but there have been quite few accounts of Russia backing down when presented with a credible threat. So I think we are making these are very important decisions based on critical assumptions, and we have to assess very thoroughly the consequences, the risk of each and every decision involved.
So you're suggesting we don't need to build up any conventional force in Europe because we know that this will exhaust his appetite? Ukraine will be, Ukraine's enough? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think Ukraine has served his purpose. I don't think we are in the early 20th century in which Putin is trying to create a buffer zone. I think what Putin is doing is using Ukraine to destroy an existing order. And if you push me to my more ludicrous moments, I would say that a lot of this is really about protecting his energy exports in a world in which we are moving toward decarbonization. And so it seems to me that it is in his interest to try to craft a coalition amongst low and middle income societies that have been resistant to meaningful steps to move beyond fossil fuels as the energy foundations of industrialization, and provide the energy they want, and create this alternative to Western European and American, surprisingly, structured Paris process that down the road eliminates his most fundamentally important asset. Clearly, he wants to keep this. And the solution to that does not lie in Lithuania or any of the other Baltics. It lies in China. It lies in Brazil. It lies in other countries who want to import and combust his energy. So if you push me to be crazy, that's kind of what I think he's up to.
So that's what Ukraine was about?
For me, yes, it's about destroying an order, yes. And creating another one in which he can be an energy supplier to a new coalition, attract China clearly and the others. So I told you, it's probably the only person in the world that believes that, but that's kind of where I'm at. I'm thinking about this. Silence.
That I just had to let it simmer a little bit. Mm-hmm. That was a fascinating conversation, and I think that is just about, given that we're a little bit over time, but that's a great conversation to wrap up the presentation on. So I will turn it over to Murad to take us out.
Yes, thank you, Max. Yeah, so with that, we're just about out of time. Thank you to everyone who came to the event today. And of course, thank you to each of our speakers for the time that they dedicated to both speaking and preparing for this event. That goes doubly for anyone in Eastern time. We apologize to you for going over.
Yeah, and today's panel event, just in closing, was presented by the Tulane Journal of Policy and Political Economy, which is an undergraduate publication located at and supported by Tulane University. If you're interested in publishing your own research, whether it's on this or any other issue on our core topics, you can visit tulanejournal.org, and submissions are currently open for our third edition to be released this spring.